Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating, highly calculated predictive history scenario. We're looking at a hypothetical February 2026 US-Iran war. And what's wild here is how the source material outlines a situation where the strongest military on Earth could theoretically win a massive, overwhelming initial battle, but then find itself completely trapped in a war it literally can't afford to finish.
Okay, so let's jump right into this with a totally staggering number. $126. According to the scenario we're unpacking today, that is the projected peak price for just a single barrel of Brent crude oil, and that's just 4 weeks into this theoretical conflict. So, how exactly do we get to that massive economic spike? Well, it all kicks off with a very specific hyper-aggressive military strategy.
Section 1. The Illusion of Victory. We start our timeline with what looks, at least on paper, like a total, decisive military victory for the United States and Israel.
The entire foundation of this initial strike relies on something called the decapitation strategy. Basically, this is a military doctrine focused on defeating your enemy by just entirely wiping out its leadership. The working theory is that once the folks at the top are gone, the regime will just naturally collapse. It's the exact same playbook the US used with Saddam Hussein back in the day. The logic is super straightforward, right? You eliminate the leader, the government shatters, and everyone gets to go home.
But man, the sheer pace of this initial strike is absolutely staggering. Picture this. At 6:45 a.m., Israeli jets hit Ali Khamenei's compound in Tehran, killing the 86-year-old supreme leader and his family. Then, within just a few hours, over 900 targets, we're talking nuclear sites, radar installations, command centers, are completely leveled. Iran's air force? Shredded. And 30 of their warships are sitting at the bottom of the ocean by day 5. Now, the Pentagon might brief this as a flawless textbook knockout, but this scenario points out a massive ideological miscalculation. See, the supreme leader actually knew the strike was coming, but flat out refused to take shelter. In Shia Islam, that's not seen as a defeat, it's viewed as martyrdom, and that fundamentally changes the entire nature of the response.
Section 2. Decentralization and ideological backlash. Now we're going to see the really severe unintended consequences of eliminating a central leader in this specific cultural context.
The source material zeroes in on a critical dynamic here. You can't decapitate what no longer has a single head. The martyrdom of the leader essentially turns the whole conflict into a jihad for the population. So instead of collapsing into chaos, the Iranian military deliberately decentralized within 48 hours. Every single region, every little cell, acquired its own orders and its own targets. The command structure didn't break, it dispersed, and that makes it infinitely harder to track and destroy.
And this brings us to a really cruel irony in the targeting strategy. The progressive cities that got heavily bombarded, places like Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz, well, they housed the most educated populations. Those were the exact people most likely to actually support internal regime change. But by dropping bombs on them, the US effectively wiped out its potential internal allies and turned them into sworn enemies. Meanwhile, the religious hardliners, the ones embedded deep inside mountain caves, they were completely untouched, highly empowered, and totally ready to fight to the very last breath.
Section 3. Exposing the petrodollar vulnerability. Let's move over to the retaliation phase, because this is where it builds into a direct attack on the actual scaffolding of the American economy, the Gulf states.
Iran's strategy here wasn't just to lash out randomly in anger, not at all. Instead, they surgically struck the financial engines of American power that operate within the petrodollar system. The Gulf states tried to play the neutrality card, but Iran completely rejected that, pointing out that they still hosted US military bases and had opened up their airspace for those initial strikes. So, in response, Iran hits the US Fifth Fleet headquarters down in Bahrain, they strike Aramco's massive oil refinery at Ras Tanura, and they even launch drones right at Dubai International Airport. And since these states sell oil in US dollars and heavily reinvest in American assets, attacking them is effectively attacking the invisible economic scaffolding of the United States.
But the really crucial vulnerability here is demographic. Just look at this breakdown. Dubai's population is 90% foreign workers. These Gulf cities are absolute miracles of modern engineering, sure, but they are built on the fatal assumption of lasting peace. These expats hold employment visas. They don't have some deep, unwavering national loyalty. So the second drones start hitting hotels and airports, that massive 90% expat workforce simply packs up and leaves. It stops the entire city in its tracks, literally like pulling the batteries right out of a toy.
Section 4. Choking the global economy. The scenario now shifts from localized regional panic to full-blown global economic strangulation, and it's centered entirely on one remarkably narrow geographic choke point.
The escalation here is just remarkably rapid. We start in February 2026 with the initial airstrikes. By day 5, the Iranian Navy is officially neutralized. But look at March 2nd. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that. Even with their navy sitting at the bottom of the ocean, they managed to effectively shut down this absolutely vital waterway using hidden, land-based drone strikes launched right out of the surrounding mountains.
And this brings us to why this specific geography matters so much. Just look at this one staggering figure, 20%. That narrow 21-mile-wide gap of the Strait of Hormuz is responsible for a massive 20% of the world's daily oil passing through it. So closing it off instantly shuts off the lifeblood for nations that are heavily reliant on this route. It hits the economies of places like Japan, India, and China pretty much overnight.
And here is the immediate financial fallout from that closure: $5 million. See, Iran didn't even need to physically blow up every single ship. They just needed to absolutely terrify the commercial insurance companies. By March 5th, insurance premiums skyrocketed to 5% of a ship's total value. That means a single trip for a large oil tanker suddenly cost $5 million just in insurance alone. This instantly dropped tanker traffic through the strait by a mind-blowing 81% in a single week.
As the conflict drags on, both sides are staring down some pretty dire strategic vulnerabilities. For the Gulf, the strait's closure doesn't just block their oil from going out, it completely blocks crucial food, medicine, and industrial supplies from entering their desert region. They're facing a literal starvation of resources because they simply cannot feed themselves. Now, on the flip side, Iran faces severe water stress. So the U.S. counters by targeting Iran's drying lakes, dams, reservoirs, and power plants. They're deliberately attempting to fracture the country internally by exploiting ethnic fault lines over who gets access to resources.
Section 5. The Math of Asymmetric War. This brings us to the core financial dilemma of modern conflict, and it really shows exactly how overwhelming high-tech conventional military power can be completely subverted by basic math.
Let's look at how this builds into a totally unwinnable equation. Just compare the cost of the Iranian Shahed 136 drone to an American Patriot Interceptor. The drone, it costs between $20,000 to $50,000 to make. The Patriot missile used to shoot it out of the sky, $4 million. Wow. So for every single dollar Iran spends on a Shahed drone, America has to spend between $80 and $200 trying to shoot it down. And what's even worse, Iran is pumping out up to 500 of these drones a month, while the U.S. only manufactures about 620 Patriots in an entire year. It mathematically bleeds the defense budget dry, totally exposing a defense industry that's built on creating the most expensive weapons rather than the most cost-effective ones. But cost is really only half the nightmare here. The other half is mobility. The tactics are frighteningly simple. Step 1, you park an innocent-looking everyday flatbed truck behind a building. Step 2, you fire 5 Shahed drones sequentially. Step 3, you just drive away and hide in city traffic before satellites can even detect the launch. Unlike an American Patriot missile system that requires 6 highly visible components and takes 30 minutes just to set up, these cheap drones launch from civilian trucks that simply shoot and scoot. It makes them pretty much impossible to efficiently track from space.
Section 6. The Unwinnable Geopolitical Trap. 3 weeks into this conflict, the global economy is absolutely screaming, and the predictive scenario forces U.S. military strategy into an impossible corner.
Here, we see a classic big-talk bluff completely falling apart. The U.S. president threatens to bomb Iranian energy infrastructure unless they reopen the strait. But Iran, they refuse to flinch. So the president has to pivot, falsely claiming to the media that productive talks are currently underway. Naturally, Iran's foreign ministry publicly responds, flat out denying any talks even exist. Ultimately, the U.S. postpones the strikes for a 5-day pause. Global markets get a temporary surge, oil drops slightly, but the reality on the ground remains entirely unchanged. And instead of folding to the pressure, the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the dead leader's son, sends this incredibly chilling message. The strait stays closed. The war continues. We will avenge every drop of blood. So the regime didn't collapse under the pressure at all. It consolidated. The highly ideological Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is now officially running a country that is completely prepared to die for their cause.
And this brilliantly illustrates the geopolitical trap here, what we can call the empire's dilemma. If America leaves, the Gulf states lose faith in American protection forever, and the petrodollar system that's propping up the U.S. economy begins to severely crack. But if America stays, the U.S. bleeds millions upon millions daily shooting down cheap drones, watching the global economy suffer from a totally self-inflicted wound.
They literally cannot walk away without shattering their economic foundation, but they absolutely cannot afford to stay in an endless, mathematically unwinnable asymmetric war.
Which brings us to a really profound observation about the nature of global superpowers. An empire founded by war has to maintain itself by war. This scenario perfectly highlights how U.S. economic centers of gravity were built in a highly vulnerable desert, relying on overwhelming, super expensive weaponry and the sheer deterrence of fear just to maintain order. And that leads us exactly to our final pressing question today. What happens when fear is no longer enough to maintain an empire? Seriously, what happens when the enemy simply stops being afraid? I'll leave you to ponder that thought about the extreme fragility of power in the modern age. I highly encourage you to look deeper into the source material and the frankly terrifying mathematics of asymmetric warfare. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around us.